The rain had just started when my key turned in the lock. It was late, almost midnight in Hartford, Connecticut, and the porch light cast a weak yellow glow across the steps. I thought the house would be silent, but when I pushed the door open, I saw him. My father stood in the living room like a statue cracked down the middle. Robert Hale, 63. He held a glass of whiskey in one hand, his knuckles white against the crystal. Behind him, sprawled across the leather sofa like a queen on her throne, sat Clarissa Vance, 45. Perfect hair, painted smile wearing my mother's silk robe like it belonged to her. My chest tightened the moment I saw her. My father's eyes were bloodshot and wet, but hard as iron. On the table beside him was a neat stack of papers. He did not say hello. He stared at me as if I were a stranger. I dropped my bag near the door and forced my voice to stay calm. "Dad, what's going on?" He laughed without humor. "What's going on?" he repeated, almost mocking. "You stole from me, from the company, from everything your mother and I built." I froze. I had no idea what he was talking about. Clarissa stood gracefully, picked up one sheet from the pile, and handed it to him. "Robert, show her. She needs to see what she's done." Her voice was honeyed and smooth, but every syllable dripped poison. He hurled the papers toward me. They scattered across the wooden floor like dead leaves caught in wind. I knelt and picked up the nearest one. Bank statements, transfers, my name forged in black ink. "This isn't real," I whispered. "I didn't do this." "You're lying." He snapped his voice like a slap. "Clarissa found these. She's been looking out for me, unlike you." My heartbeat pounded so loud it filled my ears. I stared at her. She smirked faintly satisfied like a spider who finally caught something in its web. "Dad, please think about this. You raised me to protect this company. Why would I ever?" He cut me off with a roar that shook me to my core. "You're not my daughter anymore." The sentence hit me harder than any fist could. And then the fist came anyway. He lunged forward, his hand swinging, striking me across the face. My world tilted sideways. Pain exploded behind my eye. I stumbled and hit the floor, my palms smacking the wood. Before I could breathe, his boot drove into my stomach. Once, twice. The air vanished from my lungs. I gasped, clutching my side, but he didn't stop. Somewhere above me, Clarissa laughed softly, a sound like a blade being sharpened. My fingers curled instinctively around the silver bracelet on my wrist, the one my mother had given me before she died. It was small, delicate, and it had never left me. Not once. It was the only piece of her I had left. When I pushed myself up, the bracelet slipped free. It rolled across the floor and stopped at Clarissa's feet. She bent down with a deliberate slowness, picked it up like it was a prize, and held it up to the light. She turned it between her fingers, spinning it like a ring, letting the golden lamplight catch on the silver. She didn't need to say anything. Her smile said everything. My father's breath was rough. "Get out," he said, voice hoarse and final. "Dad," I whispered, choking on the word. The house felt like it had swallowed all the warmth it ever gave me. "Get out of my house!" His roar split the room. His hand trembled, pointing at the door like it was a blade aimed at me. For a heartbeat, I just stared at him, at the man who used to lift me onto his shoulders at county fairs, who made cocoa on snowy nights. The man who told me this house was mine, too. He was gone. In his place stood a stranger who smelled like whiskey and betrayal. Clarissa leaned against the sofa, playing with the bracelet as if it belonged to her. Her shadow merged with his. I reached for my suitcase, the one I had packed earlier in the week for a work trip. It felt heavier than it ever had. My face throbbed with every step I took toward the door. When I opened it, the cold air hit me like a wall of ice. The rain had grown steadier. Behind me, the light from the living room glowed soft and golden. It used to mean safety. Tonight, it meant exile. My father hovered near the doorway, breathing hard, not meeting my eyes. Clarissa appeared behind him, her silhouette sharp against the light, still spinning my mother's bracelet around her finger like a hunter with a trophy. My chest burned, not just from the blows, but from something deeper, something breaking beyond repair. One day I whispered, "You'll regret this." He didn't answer. He slammed the door shut so hard the sound echoed down the porch. I stood there soaked in rain, suitcase in hand, staring at the wooden door as if it might open again. It didn't. Through the narrow window pane, I saw Clarissa's shadow move across the light. She laughed again, quiet and certain, twisting the bracelet one last time. That house was no longer mine. That man was no longer my father. And that night, soaked and shaking, I understood something I would never forget. A betrayal that deep does not just break you, it hardens you. It rewrites everything you know about love and blood. The rain fell harder, but my tears had already dried. When I was little, the world smelled like sawdust and sunlight. My earliest memories were of sitting on my father's shoulders at construction sites, his hard hat tilted at an angle, the sun flashing off the metal beams like they were made of gold. Back then, Robert Hale wasn't just my father. He was the man who could fix everything. He built houses, bridges, whole neighborhoods, and to me, he built the sky. I remember being 7 and clutching his rough, calloused hands as he lifted me onto the hood of his truck so I could watch the cranes swing. He would grin at me with that easy, unshakable confidence. "One day, Marissa, all this will be yours." Back then, I believed him without question. It was our world. His strength, my trust, and my mother's quiet warmth stitching it together. My mother's laugh filled every corner of that house. She wore her silver bracelet every day, a simple loop with a tiny engraving on the inside, a phrase only she and I knew. She would kneel down, fasten mine onto my wrist, and say softly, "This is how we hold on to each other." She smelled like vanilla and warm bread. My childhood was built on that scent and that silver. But when I was 14, the house changed forever. The night my mother died felt colder than any winter storm. It happened quickly, too quickly for me to make sense of it. One day, she was laughing in the kitchen with a pot of stew on the stove, and the next, there was the sound of sirens, and my father's face was pale and cracked. After the funeral, silence swallowed the house like a wave. My father did not cry where I could see him. He spent long nights at work, coming home smelling like whiskey and steel. The house echoed. No laughter, no vanilla, just the sound of boots on hardwood floors. The silver bracelet became my anchor. I wore it every day, running my thumb along the engraving whenever the silence got too loud. My father threw himself deeper into the company. At first, I thought it was his way of coping, but as the years passed, it became clear that work was the only place he felt alive. At home, he barely spoke. He didn't ask about my school projects anymore, or sit through my late-night sketching marathons. He didn't make cocoa on snowy nights. Instead, he came home after I was already in bed and left before I woke up. The house stopped being home. It became a stop between his office and construction sites. I grew quieter too. I learned to live in the silence, learned to find comfort in the mechanical whir of the heater and the steady ticking of the old kitchen clock. When I turned 16, he handed me my first set of blueprints. He said it like a command, not a dream. "You're going to learn how this works. You're going to help me run it one day." I took the papers, but his eyes never met mine. He was already somewhere else. Even when he stood next to me, he was miles away, buried under piles of ledgers and steel beams. I kept trying to reach him. I worked late in the drafting room shadowing project managers, hoping that if I proved I was capable, he'd look at me the way he used to. But every time I tried, the gap widened. When I was 19, he missed my college acceptance letter ceremony because he was out meeting a new investor. I told myself it was fine, that he loved me in his own way, but deep down, something inside me started to bend the way wood does just before it breaks. Every birthday after that, he sent a gift through his secretary. A book on architecture, a fountain pen, a check with his signature at the bottom. He never wrapped anything himself. He never said the words. "I'm proud of you" disappeared from his vocabulary. When I graduated from college and came back to work with him full-time, I walked into the same office that used to smell like him and my mother. It smelled like ink dust and something faintly sour. He was older, quieter, but still powerful. Yet every time he looked at me, there was something missing. That softness, that invisible bond that had once been unshakable, had thinned like a frayed rope. We still had the house, but it wasn't a home. The walls remembered even if he didn't. The kitchen tiles still carried the faint stain where my mother used to spill her tea. The garden still bloomed roses every spring, even though he never watered them anymore. I tried to fill the silence with my own footsteps, but it never worked. Sometimes late at night, I would sit on the front porch wearing my mother's cardigan and stare at the stars, listening to the hum of the highway. It was the only sound that didn't hurt. In those quiet hours, I would trace the silver bracelet with my thumb, whispering the engraving to myself like a prayer. We hold on. But the truth is, I was holding on alone. My father had let go a long time ago. It wasn't one single moment that broke us. It was 1,000 small cracks, hairline fractures that grew over years. Missed dinners, unanswered questions, empty birthdays, silence too loud to breathe in. When he met someone New Year's later, I should have seen it coming. I should have felt the shift in the air the way I used to feel the change before a storm. But I didn't. I kept hoping the father I remembered would come back. The man who carried me on his shoulders, who promised me the world, who said this company would be ours. I didn't realize until it was too late that I was clinging to a ghost in a house that used to be ours. A man who had already forgotten how to be a father. A silver bracelet that was still on my wrist was the only thing that hadn't changed. The bracelet remembered even when he did not, and that memory would become the only weapon I had left. The first time I saw Clarissa Vance, she wore a dark blue pencil dress and carried a leather folder under her arm as if she already belonged in my father's world. She was introduced to me in the lobby of the company headquarters as his new financial consultant. My father's voice carried that sharp, business-like edge I had grown used to. Clarissa smiled the way people do when they already know they're winning. It was polished and slow, like the smile of someone who studies her prey before sinking her teeth in. She extended her hand and I shook it, trying to ignore the faint perfume that clung to her wrist. It smelled like synthetic roses and expensive sugar, the kind of scent that masks something rotten beneath. For the first few weeks, she was just another presence in the office. She hovered at meetings, nodded at everything my father said, took notes with a silver pen that glimmered like a blade. But then small things began to shift. She started joining our family dinners at the house. At first, she sat on the far end of the table, politely laughing at my father's old construction site stories. But as time passed, she moved closer like a shadow that knows how to creep without making noise. She started finishing his sentences, laughing at jokes before he did, offering to refill his glass before he even reached for it. My father changed too. He began wearing pressed shirts to dinners at home. He shaved more often. His eyes, which had always been tired and distant since my mother died, started to glow in a way that unsettled me. I had spent years trying to bring back even a sliver of that light, and now this woman walked in and took it as if it had always been hers. At dinner, she asked me questions in a voice so sweet it almost disguised the barbs hidden underneath. "So, Marissa, you still live here with your dad," she said once, smiling, as if it was just idle chatter. But I saw the spark behind her eyes. When I told her I did because this house had always been home, she tilted her head. "That's sweet. But don't you think a grown woman should have her own place by now? Daddy needs space too?" Daddy. She called him Daddy like she was 17, not 45. My fork tightened in my hand. My father didn't notice. He laughed softly as if her words were harmless. But they weren't harmless to me. They were seeds. And she planted them carefully. She began to replace small things around the house, always with a casual smile. A new vase on the mantel where my mother's favorite lamp used to be. A painting of soft ocean waves where the photo of my parents' wedding once hung. I asked where the photo was. She said, "Oh, it didn't really match the room." My father didn't say a word. At family meetings at the company, she slowly began to speak on behalf of him. "Robert thinks we should—" She would start and he would nod, letting her finish. I watched her rearrange not just the office, but the narrative of our lives. Every word she spoke to him was gentle. Every look she gave me was something else entirely. It wasn't hostility in the way most people show it. It was quieter. A snake doesn't hiss when it's already wrapped around your throat. She made it look like she cared. She brought him coffee in the mornings. She laughed when he forgot something and gently reminded him. She acted like a guardian. But when we were alone, her smile faded and her eyes were sharp as broken glass. Once in the kitchen, I caught her holding my mother's silver teapot, the one she used for Sunday breakfasts. Her fingers traced the delicate engravings like she was staking a claim. "Your mom had good taste," she said softly. I didn't answer. She turned to me with that sly little smile. But things change, don't they? The thing that stung the most wasn't just her words. It was that my father let it happen. Every small takeover, every insult wrapped in honey. He didn't fight it. He didn't even see it. He saw youth charm a second chance at something he thought he lost. I saw a woman carving a place for herself in a home that wasn't hers. And she was doing it with precision. She started driving his car. She answered calls meant for me. She started introducing herself at the company as part of the family. I wanted to scream, to drag my father into the hallway and shake him until he saw what was happening. But every time I tried to bring it up, he brushed it off with a tired smile. "She's just trying to help," he would say. "Why are you being so defensive?" It was the same tone he used when I was a teenager and questioned his business partners. That tone that meant the conversation was already over, so I stopped arguing. But I didn't stop watching. I watched how he lit up when she entered the room. I watched how she talked to him like she was the only one who could keep him safe. I watched how she looked at me like I was in the way. One night, I came home and saw the light still on in the living room. My father was asleep in his chair. Clarissa sat near him quietly reading his old blueprints. Her fingers rested on the photo of my parents that had once been on the wall. Now it was in a frame on the floor beside the sofa. She glanced up, caught me watching her, and smirked like she had already won. She whispered so softly I almost thought I imagined it. "You'll be gone soon." It was the first time I truly felt the house shifting beneath my feet. The foundation that had once been built on family and memory was being replaced by something colder. And the worst part was my father didn't even realize it was happening. She didn't storm in. She seeped in, slowly, methodically, like water through cracks in old stone. By the time you notice, it's already too late. Manipulation doesn't always arrive with shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes it enters wearing perfume and a soft smile. Clarissa understood my father's weaknesses better than anyone. She studied them the way a hunter studies the habits of her prey. She knew his loneliness, the guilt he carried over my mother's death, the way he loved to feel needed. And she wrapped herself around those places like vines on old wood. It started with whispers. I would catch small fragments of their conversations when I passed the study at night. Her voice would be soft, almost trembling, like she hated to bring up bad news. She would say things like, "I just want to make sure no one takes advantage of you," or "I've noticed a few strange things in the accounts." At first, my father dismissed it, but she was patient. A woman like Clarissa doesn't rush. She layered her poison carefully week after week until he began to listen. I noticed the shift in his eyes before he ever said a word to me. He stopped looking at me like I was his daughter and started looking at me like I was a problem to solve. The first confrontation came quietly. He placed a few sheets of paper on the kitchen counter one morning. His face was blank, but his voice had that cold, businesslike edge. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. I picked up the papers. Transaction records from one of the company's accounts. My name was there in black ink. Transfers I had never made. I looked at him in disbelief. This isn't real. He didn't argue. He just stared. Clarissa walked in a moment later with perfect timing as if on cue. She set down a cup of coffee next to him, brushed her hand lightly against his arm, and gave me a sympathetic look that made my skin crawl. "Marissa, I know this must be hard to explain," she said gently, "but Robert has to protect what he's built." I wanted to scream at her to rip that soft tone out of her throat, but she just smiled and tilted her head like she was the reasonable one, and I was the villain. My father didn't yell that morning. He didn't need to. The silence between us was louder than anything. Over the next few weeks, more documents appeared. Each time she was there, offering a quiet word or a consoling touch on his shoulder, always making it look like she was reluctantly revealing things. She pretended to be his shield, but she was building a wall between us brick by brick. My father started canceling meetings with me about the company. He excluded me from calls I'd always been part of. When I asked why, he said things like, "We just need to be careful," or "You're too close to this." Too close to what I asked, but he never answered directly. Clarissa began showing up at my office too. She'd lean on the doorframe, her perfume creeping into the air like smoke, and say things like, "I'm just making sure everything's okay here." She'd pretend to check the books, ask innocent questions that implied I didn't know how to do my job, and then walk out with that same small smile. The people who worked with me started to notice. They didn't say anything, but I saw it in their eyes. Doubt. A single seed of doubt is all someone like Clarissa needs. One night I stayed late to work on a presentation for an upcoming contract. When I returned to my office after stepping out to grab coffee, my computer was still on, but several folders had been moved. Files I hadn't opened were now marked as recently accessed. I knew it was her. No one else had the keycard permissions to get in after hours except me and my father. And lately, Clarissa had everything he did. I confronted my father the next morning. He didn't even let me finish. He said I was being paranoid. He said Clarissa had only ever tried to help. Then he said the thing that split me down the middle. "You should be grateful she's here." Grateful. As if I was supposed to thank the woman dismantling my life. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a carefully built trap, and my father was standing on the side that held the rope. Clarissa didn't need to shout. She let the numbers and signatures do the shouting for her. Every forged transfer, every missing email, every falsified receipt pulled him closer to her and pushed me further away. She even started telling the employees that she was cleaning up my mistakes. At a board meeting, I watched her slide a folder across the table to my father. He didn't even look at me when he signed the papers authorizing her to oversee the financial review. That used to be my job. She stole it in silence. At home, the atmosphere thickened. I tried to talk to him in the evenings to remind him of who I was, who we had been before her, but he always cut me off. He said I was making everything harder than it needed to be. He started locking his office door when he never had before. Clarissa's car was always in the driveway. My father started calling her honey in front of me. I wanted to tell him how cruel it was, how much of my mother still lived in these walls, how he was letting a stranger erase everything she built, but my voice never made it out. Clarissa always found a way to be in the room when I tried to talk. She didn't interrupt directly. She just stood near him, touching his arm lightly, whispering small reassurances that I could never fully hear. Her presence was enough. It turned every conversation into a losing battle. The worst part wasn't that she was winning. The worst part was that he wanted her to. He wanted to believe she was the good one because it meant he didn't have to face the possibility that he was betraying me. That his need to feel loved again was turning him into someone I barely recognized. One night, I found her in my father's study going through a locked drawer. She looked up when she realized I was standing there. She didn't look surprised. She smiled, tucked a piece of paper into her purse, and said softly, "It's not personal, Marissa. Some people are just better at protecting what's theirs." I wanted to rip that purse from her hand, but my father walked in a second later, and suddenly, I was the one who looked like the intruder. Clarissa wrapped her arms around him like she needed protecting. I saw the flicker of anger in his eyes as he turned toward me. In that moment, I understood she had him completely. It wasn't about logic anymore. It was about control. She had convinced him to see me not as his daughter, but as a threat. And once that happens, the truth doesn't matter. Only the lie they've chosen to believe does. It happened on a Friday night when the world felt wrong from the moment I stepped into the driveway. The house lights were still on, though my father usually slept early these days. Clarissa's car was parked near the steps like it belonged there, its sleek black hood glistening under the street light. The rain from earlier had stopped, but the air was damp, the kind of air that sticks to your lungs. My stomach twisted as I reached for the door handle. Something in me already knew this night would change everything. Inside, the house didn't smell like home. It smelled like cheap floral perfume and bourbon. My father's voice echoed from the living room low at first, then rising sharply like a whip. Clarissa was sitting on the couch, one leg crossed neatly over the other, holding a folder in her lap. Her expression was soft and rehearsed, the perfect mask of concern. My father paced the room like a man about to hand down a sentence. He didn't even notice me until I spoke. "Dad," I said quietly. He turned toward me too fast. His eyes were bloodshot, his face flushed, and I knew he'd been drinking. "You've really done it this time," he spat. I frowned, clutching the strap of my bag. What are you talking about? Clarissa rose slowly like a snake uncoiling and handed him the folder. I recognized the pages even before I saw them. The same forged transactions, the same bank records she'd been planting piece by piece for months. But this time she had stacked them together like a bomb. Robert, she said softly. She needs to hear it from you. He threw the folder onto the coffee table. Paper slid out, scattering across the floor like snow. How could you? He roared. How could you steal from me, from this company, from your own family? His voice broke into pieces on the last word. I didn't. I said firmly, though, my chest tightened. This is her. She's been doing this. I pointed at Clarissa. She tilted her head, looking almost amused. Marissa, she sighed. This is exactly what guilty people do. You've been so jealous since I came here. I tried to warn him you'd react this way. She's lying, I snapped. She forged these. You know me, Dad. But he didn't. Not anymore. He looked at her like she was the only solid ground in the room and looked at me like I was a stranger who had broken into his house. The silence between us was more brutal than shouting. Clarissa walked closer to him, placed a hand on his arm, and whispered something too low for me to hear. His jaw tightened. I recognized the look in his eyes. He had made a decision before I even walked in. I stepped forward. Dad, listen to me. Please. She's enough, he roared. His voice thundered against the walls. I have had enough of your lies. You've been nothing but trouble since she came into this house. Do you think I can't see through you? The accusation landed like a punch. All the years I had stood by him, built the company with him, mourned my mother with him, now reduced to this moment. Clarissa stepped back slightly, letting him own the stage. She knew the power of letting someone else deliver the killing blow. You're not my daughter anymore, he growled, and this time it wasn't just words. It was a verdict. Something in me cracked. How can you say that? I whispered, barely breathing. He didn't answer with words. He answered with his fist. The impact came fast, sudden, as if it had been waiting all along. Pain shot across my cheekbone, white and blinding. My knees buckled, and I hit the wooden floor, my palms burning as they caught my fall. He kicked me once in the ribs, hard enough to steal my breath. Then again. The sound of his boot connecting with my body was sharp and final. Clarissa stood behind him, watching like someone enjoying a private show. There was no shock on her face, only satisfaction. My vision blurred, but through the haze I saw her lift her hand to her mouth as if to hide a smile. The house echoed with my ragged breathing. Get up, he barked. Pack your things. You're done here. I coughed, tasting blood on my tongue, but pushed myself to my feet. My body trembled not from fear, but from the brutal reality settling in. This wasn't just a fight. This was exile. Dad, I managed to choke out. You're wrong about her. She's using you. Everything we built, everything Mom left, it's all going to disappear. His face twisted at the mention of my mother. For a split second, I thought something might break through the fog of anger, but Clarissa moved closer and wrapped her arm around him. Don't let her manipulate you, she whispered. He nodded like a puppet on a string. You're leaving tonight, he said, or I'll make you. He stormed toward the staircase, dragging my old suitcase out from under the banister where I kept it for work trips. He threw it at my feet. Take it, and don't ever come back. My hands clenched into fists, but I forced myself to breathe. Arguing now would only feed Clarissa's narrative. She wanted me angry. She wanted me broken. Instead, I knelt down, slowly opened the suitcase, and began to pack what little I had left upstairs. Every folded shirt felt like a piece of my life being buried. Every book that had once sat on my childhood shelves felt like a goodbye I hadn't planned. When I came down the stairs, Clarissa was sitting on the sofa with her legs crossed, wearing my mother's robe again. The same robe that used to smell like vanilla and warm mornings now smelled like cheap perfume and betrayal. She was holding something in her hand. My bracelet. The silver bracelet my mother had given me the day she died. I must have dropped it in the chaos. She twirled it between her fingers with the ease of someone spinning a coin. The light from the chandelier caught on the silver flashing like a knife. She didn't say anything, just looked at me with that quiet, poisonous smile. My father stood near the door, breathing heavily, pointing at the porch. "Get out," he said. "Now." My grip tightened on the suitcase handle. Rain had started again outside, tapping against the porch like a quiet drumbeat. For a moment, I thought about begging him to stop, to remember the way it used to be. But I knew better. Begging would not bring back the man who built my world. He was already gone. Only a stranger remained. One day I said softly, "You're going to regret this." His face didn't change. His hand didn't lower. Clarissa lifted the bracelet to her lips, kissed it like a trophy, then let it dangle from her finger. The image burned itself into me. I walked past him without looking back. The door opened with a creak that felt like a lifetime splitting down the middle. The cold hit me full in the face, sharp and wet. I stepped onto the porch, the suitcase wheels clattering against the wood. Behind me, the light from the living room poured out warm and golden, but it wasn't warmth anymore. It was a prison I was finally being shoved out of. He slammed the door before I reached the bottom step. The sound echoed through the quiet street like a gunshot. I stood there soaked and shaking, staring at the house I had grown up in. A house that no longer remembered me. A house that now belonged to someone else. Through the window, I could see Clarissa's silhouette spinning my mother's bracelet as she laughed softly. She had won this round. But I felt something shift inside me beneath the bruises and the heartbreak, a cold, still place where the fire would grow later. I walked down the steps into the rain, dragging the suitcase behind me. Each step away from that house felt like a step toward something I couldn't yet name. But I knew this wasn't the end. This was the moment the story turned. The night the daughter became an exile. The night a stranger held my mother's memory in her hand. The night I began to understand that revenge doesn't need to burn right away. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it watches. Sometimes it's ice. And ice cuts clean. The rain followed me all the way to Allison's apartment like it was determined to soak itself into my bones. She lived across town in an old red brick building with peeling paint and a crooked mailbox that stuck every time you tried to open it. We had been friends since college, the kind of friendship built on late-night study sessions, shared secrets, and silent understanding. When she opened the door that night, her eyes went wide at the sight of my face. I hadn't even realized how bad I looked until I saw her reflection of me. My cheek was already bruised, a deep purple spreading under my skin, and there was dried blood at the corner of my lip. I was shaking, not from cold, but from the shock that hadn't yet settled into something I could name. She didn't ask any questions at first. She just stepped aside and let me in. The warmth of her apartment felt strange after the sharp night air. She made me sit on the couch, pressed a mug of chamomile tea into my hands, and wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. When I finally told her what had happened, the words came out like broken glass, sharp and uneven. She didn't interrupt. She listened the way only old friends can listen without flinching. When I got to the part where my father hit me, she went still, her jaw tightening. And when I told her about the bracelet, about Clarissa's smirk, something in her eyes went cold. "You're staying here," she said simply, as if it wasn't a question. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I lay on the couch staring at the ceiling, tracing the familiar engraving on my wrist out of habit before realizing the bracelet was gone. My hand froze in the air. That empty patch of skin felt colder than the rain outside. The bracelet had been a piece of my mother, the last thread that tied me to the home that no longer wanted me. Now it sat in Clarissa's hands like a trophy. My chest ached in a way no bruise could match. I didn't cry. I had already cried too much standing on that porch. The tears had run out, leaving only silence. It was strange, the kind of silence that isn't empty but sharp. It pressed against my ears, making everything louder. My heartbeat, my breath, the faint sound of the city outside. I stared at the shadows on the ceiling and thought about every moment that had led to this night. The smell of whiskey, my father's voice saying, "You're not my daughter anymore." The sound of the door slamming, and Clarissa's laugh, always her laugh. Around 3 in the morning, something inside me clicked. Not like a light switch, more like the slow turn of a lock that had been stuck for years. The grief didn't disappear, but it shifted. It hardened into something cold and still. It was the first time in months I wasn't shaking. The betrayal was already done. I couldn't undo it. But I could decide what came next. In that quiet apartment wrapped in Allison's old blanket, I decided that what came next would not be begging. It would not be crawling. It would not be silence. The next morning, the world felt gray and flat. The rain had stopped, but the streets still glistened with puddles. I made myself a cup of black coffee and sat by the window watching cars pass below. Every sip burned against my split lip, but I didn't flinch. The pain was good. It reminded me I was still here. Allison came out of her room with her hair tied in a loose bun and handed me an ice pack. "You should press this on your cheek," she said gently. I pressed it against my skin and felt the throb dull slightly. She hesitated, then asked, "Do you want to call the police?" I shook my head slowly. "Not yet." She didn't push. She knew me well enough to understand that not yet didn't mean never. It meant something was already forming behind my eyes. A plan I wasn't ready to speak out loud. In the days that followed, time blurred together. I didn't return to the house. I didn't answer my father's calls because there weren't any. He didn't try to reach me. That hurt more than the bruises. Clarissa had won that battle so easily he didn't even feel the need to check if I had survived it. At night, I lay awake in the guest room, tracing the absence of my bracelet like a scar, replaying his words over and over. "You're not my daughter anymore." They echoed in the dark, sharper than the rain. But the longer I listened, the less power they had. By the end of the week, they were just words, cruel, heavy, but no longer defining me. I began to wake up earlier each morning as if something inside me was pulling me forward. One morning, I walked past a mirror and stopped. My face was still bruised, a shadow of purple fading into yellow along my jaw, but my eyes had changed. They weren't soft anymore. They weren't searching for explanations. They were cold, focused. My father had chosen his side, and that choice had burned the bridge between us to ash. I didn't have to prove myself to him anymore. I didn't have to beg him to see the truth. I had nothing left to lose. That realization was terrifying and liberating all at once. I started going through my files at work. Allison helped me set up in her kitchen, spreading papers across the counter like a war table. Contracts, ownership records, old wills. Years of financial documents I had kept copies of because something in me had always known I'd need them. My mother had taught me to keep things safe, to build quietly. My father had never paid attention to the fine print. Clarissa didn't know the full history of what she was trying to take, but I did. As I flipped through the old documents, I found the one my mother had made me memorize when I was 16. The original will. Her handwriting was still there, faint but strong, and next to it, the claws that made my hands tighten around the paper. Everything. The house, the company, the estate. All of it would pass to me. The only way to change it required both her and my father's signatures. She was gone, which meant her original wishes were still the legal foundation, and Clarissa had no power to alter that. I stared at the paper for a long time, letting the weight of it sink into me. The woman who had given me that bracelet had not left me defenseless. She had left me the future. My father had forgotten that. Clarissa had underestimated it, but I never had. That night, I stood in Allison's small kitchen, the light flickering above me, and breathed in the quiet. It was different now. It didn't feel like grief pressing against my lungs. It felt like space opening up, the kind of silence that holds strategy. Allison leaned against the counter and watched me quietly. "You're planning something," she said softly. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. She knew. She crossed the room and squeezed my shoulder once, not as comfort, but as a promise. I was no longer the woman standing in the rain outside a house that rejected her. I was the woman gathering pieces, and when I was ready, I would walk back in, not with tears, but with power. In the mirror above the sink, I caught a glimpse of myself. The bruise on my face, the set of my jaw, the hollow where the bracelet had been. For the first time, I didn't see a victim. I saw the beginning of something far colder and sharper than rage. Clarissa thought she had stripped me of everything. She didn't realize she had stripped away my last hesitation. My father thought he had broken me. He didn't realize he had set me free. The thing about rage is that it burns bright and fast, but strategy is different. Strategy is quiet. Strategy is the way cold water seeps into stone and splits it apart over time. In the days after the night my father threw me out, I stopped waiting for calls that were never going to come. I stopped crying over the bracelet I had lost. I began thinking like the woman my mother raised me to be. Not the daughter who clung to the past, but the woman who could build something from its ruins. I spent my mornings in Allison's kitchen spreading documents across the small wooden table as if I were mapping a battlefield. Property deeds, bank records, contracts, emails, signatures, dates. Every piece of my life and my mother's legacy laid out in black and white. I knew Clarissa believed she had already won. That was her mistake. She thought control was the same as power, but she didn't know what my mother had built quietly in the background. She didn't know about the sealed documents, the legal language, the contingencies my mother had insisted upon when I was still a teenager. She had prepared for a storm long before it came. I went through every line of the original will, memorizing it like scripture. Every clause was a locked door Clarissa didn't even know existed. My father had never bothered to read the fine print. He had trusted my mother and then forgotten, but I had never forgotten. I could still hear her voice from years ago, soft and calm, saying, "Marissa, always keep what's yours in writing." On the third night after the fallout, I called James Calloway. He had been my mother's lawyer and one of the few people I trusted completely. I hadn't spoken to him in months, but the moment he picked up, his voice softened. "Marissa." I heard something happened. News traveled fast in Hartford. I told him everything, not with tears, but with precision. When I finished, he was silent for a moment. Then he said the words that shifted everything. "Then it's time to make them regret underestimating you." We met the next morning in his office, a narrow building that smelled like old wood and paper. James was in his late 60s with silver hair and the kind of steady eyes that made people listen. He laid out the legal strategy like a general planning a siege. First, we would file a formal notice to freeze all company assets. Clarissa thought she was running things through my father, but she wasn't legally listed as an executive or owner. I was. Her name appeared nowhere in the foundation of the company. Second, we would schedule a will reading. My mother's original will was still legally binding, and my father had never completed the process to alter it. Clarissa might have thought she had convinced him to do it, but intent without legal action is meaningless. Third, we would build a case that revealed her financial forgeries. Every fake transfer, every signature she had tried to mimic, every late-night file she had touched would be traced back to her. She had been sloppy because she believed no one would question her. She had counted on my silence. She would learn how wrong she was. I spent hours with James going through every document I had saved. He called in a forensic accountant, a woman named Sarah with sharp eyes and no patience for liars. She combed through the numbers like a scalpel, highlighting every inconsistency. "She's good," Sarah said, finally tapping the papers, "but not good enough." That night, for the first time in weeks, I felt something other than grief. I felt control. Not the loud, fiery kind. The quiet kind that sits deep in your bones and makes you steady. I didn't tell my father what I was doing. I didn't even look at the house when Allison drove me past it one morning. They would find out soon enough. Part of me imagined Clarissa walking through the living room in her robe, still spinning my mother's bracelet around her finger, convinced she had me crushed beneath her heel. I almost smiled. Let her believe it. Let her build her throne on rotten wood. The higher she climbed, the harder she would fall. I started dressing differently. Cleaner, sharper. My bruises were fading, but I didn't hide them under makeup. They were a reminder. Each time I looked in the mirror, I saw not weakness, but evidence. A story that would end in a courtroom, not a kitchen argument. James filed the legal notices within the week. The asset freeze went into effect so quickly that Clarissa's access to company accounts was cut off overnight. I could picture the fury on her face when the bank informed her she wasn't authorized. My father would be confused, maybe even furious, but confusion was part of the plan. This wasn't about arguing with him anymore. It was about removing the stage on which she had performed her lies. The next step was the letter. James sent an official summons to my father and the board of trustees for the formal will reading. My mother's signature at the bottom of that document might as well have been a hammer. There was no version of this story where Clarissa walked away with everything she thought she owned. When Allison asked me how I felt, I told her the truth, like I'm sharpening a blade. She didn't flinch. She knew what that meant. I spent the nights going over the sequence of events in my head. The night he hit me. The night he chose her. I replayed it not to hurt myself, but to ensure I would never soften when the time came. Betrayal was a weight, but in the right hands, it could also be a weapon. I began working out in the mornings, something I hadn't done since college. It wasn't about strength. It was about clarity. My lungs burned, my muscles ached, but every step on the treadmill felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I wasn't the girl on the porch anymore. I was a woman with a plan. One night, James called to tell me the date was set for the will reading. "She won't see it coming," he said. "Your father might not either. Are you ready for that?" I was ready the moment he threw me out, I said quietly. When I hung up, I stood by the window of Allison's apartment, staring out at the dark city. Somewhere across town in the house that used to be mine, Clarissa was probably still drinking from my mother's favorite cup, laughing in the living room she'd infested like rot. But that house wasn't a fortress. It was a glass palace waiting for a stone. Strategy isn't fire. It doesn't rage. It waits. It builds. And when it moves, it cuts clean. I closed the file folder, slid the legal documents back into my bag, and exhaled slowly. The storm they had unleashed on me was about to turn around. And this time, it would be silent. The morning the legal letters went out, Hartford was quiet in the kind of way that only happens at the beginning of a storm. The sky hung low and gray, the streets still slick from the night's rain. I stood by Allison's kitchen window with a cup of coffee cooling between my hands, staring at nothing in particular, but feeling everything move beneath the surface. It wasn't adrenaline. It wasn't fear. It was something colder. The certainty that the first strike had already landed before they even saw it coming. At exactly 9:30, James Calloway's assistant sent the official summons for the will reading to my father's home and to the company headquarters. It was addressed formally to Robert Hale and Clarissa Vance as an affiliated partner. The wording was clear, final, and legally airtight. Attached to the summons was the notice of temporary asset freeze authorized by the court. Every company account with my signature on it, every joint property tied to my mother's estate, every piece of land under Hale Construction, all of it was locked tight. For years, my father had trusted Clarissa to speak for him in the financial realm, but legally, she was nothing. She didn't own a single share. She was a shadow dressed like a queen, and shadows vanish in daylight. I pictured the moment they opened the envelope. My father confused, maybe even furious, not understanding how things could move without his say-so. Clarissa masking her panic under that practiced smile, her mind racing for a way out. But there wouldn't be one. The foundation beneath her carefully constructed illusion was already cracking. I spent the morning at James's office going over every step of the process with a precision that felt almost surgical. His office smelled like paper and old varnish, the kind of place where power wasn't shouted but written. James was calm as always, his glasses perched low on his nose as he flipped through the files. "They won't be expecting this," he said simply. "People like her never do. They build their empires on charm, not contracts. You have the contracts." His words weren't meant to comfort me, and they didn't. They only sharpened my focus. "The will reading is in 7 days," he continued. "That gives them time to squirm, but not time to move. You'll need to be ready for a storm when they realize the floor isn't theirs anymore." I nodded once. I didn't need a pep talk. I didn't need justice wrapped in warmth. I needed precision. When I walked out of his office that afternoon, the wind had picked up, whipping my coat around me. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like the girl who had been thrown out into the rain. I felt like the storm itself. By the second day after the letters were delivered, the reaction came. I didn't have to see it to know it. My father called James's office, shouting down the line, demanding to know how this was possible. James, being the professional he was, responded with measured calm and legal clarity. "Robert," he told him, "your late wife's will is still legally binding. Your daughter is the sole heir and beneficiary of the estate and the controlling interest in Hale Construction. Any attempt to transfer assets without proper authorization would be considered fraudulent. This is not a personal matter. It's law." Clarissa called next. She didn't shout. People like her don't scream on the first hit. She tried to sound composed, smooth as always. She said words like misunderstanding and unnecessary and family. But there's nothing softer than a woman who knows the game is slipping away. When she realized she couldn't charm her way past legal language, her voice sharpened. She threatened to have me exposed. James calmly reminded her she had no standing. He ended the call before she could finish her performance. I spent those days in deliberate silence. I didn't answer any calls. I didn't drive past the house. I let them twist. It's a rare kind of power to say nothing and let the enemy talk themselves into fear. On the third day, the company board sent me an email requesting a private meeting to clarify the situation. I agreed. When I walked into that boardroom, I wasn't the bruised woman they thought they'd buried in the storm. I was composed, black coat, hair pulled back, no apology in my voice. They didn't expect that. Most of them had worked with my father for years and had seen me grow up in those hallways. To them, I had always been Robert Hale's daughter. That day, I walked in as the woman who legally owned the company they sat in. James had already sent them copies of the will and the asset freeze orders. They had no ground to stand on but fear. The oldest board member, a man who had been with the company since before I was born, cleared his throat and asked, "Is this true? Marissa, that you've frozen all of Robert's accounts?" I met his eyes without blinking. "No," I said evenly. "I've frozen what was never his to give away." Murmurs rippled around the table. I let them talk. They needed to hear the weight of the truth settling on their shoulders. They had watched Clarissa slither her way into the company like ivy, but none of them had challenged it. Not once, because my father had been their shield. Now that shield was gone. Clarissa wasn't there that day. She probably thought she could handle this through whispers and manipulation. But law isn't a whisper. Law is a hammer. I left that boardroom with more than legal power. I left with their silence. Silence is the first sign of fear shifting sides. On the fourth day, Allison caught me staring out the window again, fingers tracing the faint indentation on my wrist where the bracelet used to rest. "You're getting ready for war," she said. "I'm already in it," I replied. That night, I dreamed of my mother. She wasn't speaking. She was standing in the kitchen, the one Clarissa had tried to erase, wearing her bracelet. The same silver catching the morning light. When I woke, the heaviness in my chest was gone, replaced by something sharp and clear. On the fifth day, James called with an update. They tried to access the accounts again. He said, a hint of amusement in his voice. The bank flagged it. "She's starting to panic." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Panic was the beginning of the end. On the sixth day, a car pulled up outside Allison's building. I didn't need to look out the window to know who it was. Clarissa has a way of making the air feel toxic even before she enters a room. She rang the bell. I opened the door. She was dressed perfectly, as always, hair-smooth lipstick flawless. But her eyes betrayed her. The calm surface had cracked. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady but tight around the edges. "No," I said simply. "You need to lose." Her jaw clenched, but she forced a smile. "You don't understand what you're doing. Your father chose you." I finished for her. And now he'll live with what comes with that choice. I didn't let her inside. She stood there for a moment studying me like she always did, trying to find the weakness she could twist. But I wasn't the same woman she thought she'd broken. When she realized that her eyes flashed something darker, a hint of fear, she walked away without another word. On the seventh day, the courthouse conference room was silent as James and I entered. My father sat on one side of the long table, looking older than I'd ever seen him. He wasn't wearing the pressed shirt Clarissa used to lay out for him. His tie was crooked, his eyes heavy with sleeplessness. Clarissa sat beside him in a white suit, her posture straight, chin lifted. But the faint tension in her jaw betrayed her. She wasn't in control anymore. I walked to my seat across from them without hesitation. The original will sat on the table, sealed and waiting. My mother's handwriting in the margins faint but still legible. James adjusted his glasses and nodded to the clerk to begin the formal reading. This wasn't the courtroom showdown yet. This was the moment the truth would surface in black ink. Clarissa had spent months spinning her lies in whispers. I had spent weeks turning silence into a weapon. The first strike had landed, and as the clerk's voice began to read my mother's words aloud, I saw the exact moment Clarissa's face shifted. Not dramatically, just enough. A flicker. A single second where the mask slipped and the woman who thought she could steal everything realized she was standing on air. My father's hands tightened on the table. The sound of paper rustling filled the room. The storm had officially arrived. The conference room was cold in the way only courthouse rooms could be, that sterile chill that crept into your skin and made everything sound sharper. The table was long polished, reflecting the faint overhead lights. I sat on one side beside James, my back straight, my hands resting still on the table, and across from me sat the two people who had turned my world into a battlefield. My father looked as though he had aged 10 years in a single week. His shirt collar was wrinkled, his tie loose, his eyes red around the edges like he hadn't slept. Clarissa was immaculate as always, wearing a white suit that looked expensive, probably chosen to project confidence. But there was a crack in her mask, a faint tightening around her mouth that most people might have missed. I didn't. She crossed her legs with deliberate elegance, but I could see her nails digging into her palm under the table. She was bracing herself. That alone almost made me smile. The clerk entered and placed the sealed envelope on the table. My mother's will. The original one. I had held this document in my hands years ago, memorized the handwriting in the margins, the elegant loops of her signature. It was more than paper. It was the last piece of her voice preserved in ink. James leaned slightly toward me and whispered, "Let them listen." The clerk cleared his throat and began to read each word, slicing through the air like a blade. My mother's name, the date, the declaration of intent. Her voice wasn't there, but I could hear it anyway. Every clause had been written with precision, with the kind of foresight that only comes from a woman who understands that trust can crumble, but law can endure. My father shifted in his seat when her name was spoken, as if the sound alone hurt him. Good. It should. He had betrayed everything she built. Clarissa didn't move at first, but as the clerk continued reading the section outlining the estate the company shares and the conditions under which ownership could be transferred, her eyes flicked up at James and then at me. She was looking for a weakness, some hint that this was still a negotiation. There wasn't one. Her smile faltered when the clerk reached the critical line. The controlling interest and assets of Hale Construction and all associated properties shall pass entirely to my daughter Marissa Hale as sole heir and executor. No alteration to this clause shall be considered valid without my co-signature, which cannot be obtained posthumously. Silence followed. Even the sound of the clock seemed to stop. My father blinked slowly, like a man who'd been hit by something invisible. Clarissa's breath caught just barely, but enough for me to see the panic flicker in her chest. James didn't smile. He didn't have to. The law was doing all the talking for us. The clerk continued with the formal reading, going through each property, each account, each share that bore my mother's name and was now legally mine. My father stared at the table, and for the first time I saw his shoulders sag, not from anger, but from something heavier. Realization. He had handed everything to Clarissa, thinking it was his to give, never once understanding that the empire he thought was built on his name was actually built on my mother's. And now it belonged to me. Clarissa tried to recover. Of course she did. She leaned forward slightly, projecting calm, and said in her softest, most calculated voice, "I think what your mother intended was for this company to remain stable and not be used to." James interrupted her with a sharp, precise tone. "Ms. Vance, you are not a party to this will. You have no standing here." Her jaw tightened. She hated being reminded of her actual place in this story. My father turned to her, perhaps for reassurance, perhaps out of habit, but she didn't meet his eyes. Her mask was slipping, and she knew it. The clerk continued reading until the final paragraph. "This will is executed with the full intent to protect my daughter's inheritance and ensure Hale Construction remains in the family bloodline. In the event of any attempt to contest these terms by outside parties, immediate legal measures are to be enacted." My mother had even written that clause to be ironclad. I felt a strange swell in my chest, not quite triumph, but something steadier. It wasn't revenge. It was justice written years before Clarissa ever walked into our lives. When the clerk finished, the silence was thick. James tapped his pen against the table, once a small, deliberate sound that made Clarissa flinch. As of this moment, he said evenly, Ms. Hale is the legal owner of Hale Construction, the Hale family estate, and all associated assets. Any action taken by other parties to access, transfer, or profit from these assets without her consent will be considered unlawful. My father finally spoke. His voice cracked. Marissa. He said my name like it was a question, like he was hoping this was all some misunderstanding I would fix for him. But there was nothing to fix. You should have read the papers, I said quietly. You should have listened before you believed her. Clarissa's hand shot out to touch his arm, but he pulled it back before she could. That single movement said more than words. He was starting to understand the gravity of what he'd done. Not because he regretted choosing her over me, but because the foundation of their alliance had just vanished. Clarissa's power was built on air, and the law had blown it apart. She leaned forward, her voice lower now, less polished. You don't have to do this, Marissa. We can come to some kind of arrangement. I stared at her, remembering the night she spun my mother's bracelet around her finger while I stood in the rain with blood in my mouth. I remembered her voice telling me I'd be gone soon. And then I remembered my mother's handwriting. You have nothing to offer me, I said. You never did. Something dark flickered in her eyes. It wasn't sadness. It was fury. A predator who just realized the cage door had shut around her. My father rubbed his temples, his hands shaking slightly. He wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking at her, and for the first time I saw doubt flood his face. Clarissa saw it too. Her composure cracked, just a hairline fracture, but enough. Robert, she hissed softly, don't let her do this. You know this company doesn't run without us. Us. The word hung in the air like poison. My father flinched. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. This was the part where their little kingdom began to eat itself. James pushed the papers toward me. All you need to do is sign the acknowledgement of inheritance. It's yours, fully. No contest. I took the pen and signed without looking at either of them. The sound of the pen scratching the paper was like a blade sliding out of its sheath. It was done. I was no longer standing outside in the rain with nothing. I was the one holding the ground they were standing on. When I looked up, Clarissa's perfect smile was gone. Her lips were pressed into a thin line. Her shoulders had stiffened. She had lost. My father didn't look furious anymore. He looked hollow. I wondered for a brief second if he remembered the promises he made when I was a child when he told me the company would be mine one day. Or maybe he only remembered the way he slammed the door that night. Either way, it didn't matter. My mother's voice had already spoken louder than his betrayal. The clerk gathered the documents and James rose to his feet. This concludes the reading, he said firmly. All legal authority now rests with Ms. Hale. He turned to my father. Robert, if I were you, I'd seek counsel. Things will be different now. Clarissa pushed back her chair a little too fast, the legs scraping against the tile. A sharp sound that made everyone flinch. She stood, her shoulders tight, her carefully composed image unraveling in real time. This isn't over, she whispered. I met her eyes steadily. It is for you. She didn't reply. She just grabbed her bag turned on her heel and stormed out of the room, her heels echoing down the hallway. My father stayed seated for a long time, his hands gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing holding him up. He finally looked at me, his eyes red and tired. Marissa, he said again, but there was nothing left to say. Goodbye, Dad, I said softly and stood. The moment I stepped outside the courthouse, the air felt different. The sky was still gray, the wind still cold, but for the first time since that night on the porch, I felt something solid under my feet. Power didn't roar. It didn't scream. It whispered through every breath of the city. My mother's will had spoken for me. The war wasn't over. But the balance had shifted, and they both knew it. The aftermath didn't arrive like thunder. It came like slow rain, steady and unstoppable, seeping into every corner of their perfect little facade, until it crumbled. After the will reading, Clarissa and my father walked out of that courthouse in silence. For the first time, she wasn't clinging to his arm like she owned him. She was walking 2 steps ahead, her back stiff, her chin raised like she was holding on to the last shreds of control. My father trailed behind her, slower, heavier, like a man finally realizing he had been walking toward the edge of a cliff for months. I didn't follow them. I didn't need to. The first strike had landed. The twist had unraveled. The storm was theirs to weather now. Within 48 hours, Hale Construction's board received official notice of my new authority as controlling owner and executor of the estate. It wasn't a surprise, not after the reading, but the impact rippled through the company like a quiet shockwave. Men who had once smiled politely at Clarissa during board meetings suddenly avoided her eyes. Some whispered in hallways. Others called James's office, pretending they hadn't known anything. Loyalty built on convenience doesn't survive when the tide turns. Clarissa had spent months worming her way into every conversation, but legally she was still nothing. And now the people who once tolerated her saw her as exactly that, a liability. She tried to fight it at first. She called my father's longtime financial advisor and tried to access accounts. She was told firmly that her name wasn't on any of them. She called the company lawyer hoping to find a loophole. There wasn't one. My mother had locked everything down years before Clarissa had ever painted her first smile. Every door she tried to push through was already bolted shut. My father didn't defend her. He couldn't. He was too busy trying to stop the sinking ship that used to be his version of power. I heard about their first argument 2 days after the will reading from a board member who didn't bother to hide the smirk in his voice. Clarissa had stormed into his office screaming about betrayal, about promises about how she had sacrificed everything. He'd shouted back that she'd ruined him. Their voices had echoed through the hallway, pulling eyes and whispers. People love to watch a king and queen fall. By the third day, she was no longer showing up at company meetings. By the end of the week, she stopped showing up at the house too. I imagined her packing her designer clothes into expensive luggage, furious that the palace she thought she owned was never really hers. And I imagined my father standing alone in that house, staring at the walls that had belonged to my mother long before him and realizing they were never going to echo with her voice again. He called me once during that week, just once. I let the phone ring. It wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. There was nothing left to say that could undo what he had done. The night he chose her over me was carved into me like stone. There are some wounds that don't heal with apologies. They only stop bleeding when you stop expecting anything from the person who caused them. Meanwhile, my silence worked louder than any confrontation. The company adapted quickly. I didn't have to fire Clarissa. She simply evaporated from their structure like smoke disappearing when the window opens. The employees who had once listened to her started reporting directly to me. The board, who once saw me as a side character, now addressed me as the woman in charge. And my father, who once stood at the center of it all, now sat in the corner of the empire he'd helped build but no longer controlled. It wasn't revenge in the cinematic way people expect. No shouting, no dramatic showdown in the middle of a hallway. It was just the sound of power returning to where it had always belonged. Quiet, precise, final. The house, the company, the assets, the name. Everything they had tried to rip away from me was now mine, legally, publicly, irreversibly. My father had gambled everything on her and he'd lost. I thought I would feel elated. I thought I'd feel the rush of victory. But what I felt was something quieter, a steady calm, a weight that had been pressing on my chest for months finally sliding off. One evening, as the sun set behind the tall buildings downtown, I walked into the company's lobby alone. The same place where Clarissa had first walked in wearing that blue dress, smiling like she already owned everything she touched. The marble floors gleamed under my shoes. The receptionist looked up nervous at first, then straightened. Everyone could feel the shift. Power isn't loud. It changes the air in a room. It rewrites the way people look at you. I walked through the halls with steady steps. I didn't need to announce that I was back. The walls remembered me. My mother's name was still etched into the foundation of this place, not Clarissa's. By the end of the week, Clarissa's absence was no longer a topic of whispers. It was simply accepted. My father stayed away from the company too. I didn't push him out. I didn't need to. He pushed himself out the moment he chose her over his own blood. From what I heard, he spent most of his days alone in that house now. The house she had decorated, the house where she had laughed as she stripped it of my mother's memory. Now it was just him and silence. And silence has a way of eating people alive when they no longer have anyone left to blame. One night, I stood outside that same house. I didn't go in. I didn't need to. The porch light cast the same yellow glow it had the night he threw me out, but everything felt smaller now. The house wasn't a fortress anymore. It was just wood and walls. The woman who'd once worn my mother's robe and twirled my bracelet like a trophy was gone. The man who'd once called himself my father was just a silhouette in the living room, hunched over, staring at nothing. I turned away and walked down the steps with no weight pressing on my shoulders. The storm wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to them. When I returned to Allison's apartment that night, she looked at me with quiet understanding. "You don't look like someone who just won," she said. "Because this isn't winning," I answered softly. "It's taking back what was already mine." And that was the truth. There was no grand celebration, no fireworks, just the steady quiet of something being set right, a balance restored. A woman who thought she could take everything now had nothing. A father who thought his power was infinite now lived in the ruins of his own choices. And I, the daughter who had stood outside in the rain, now walked through my world with no one left to fear. The aftermath wasn't loud. It was clean. Victory didn't come with applause. It came quietly like a tide returning to its rightful shore. A month after the will reading my name sat alone on every document, every board ledger, every line that mattered. Marissa Hale. Not Robert Hale. Not Clarissa Vance. Mine. The company moved like a machine, shedding rust, recalibrating under my hands. People who had once avoided me in hallways now greeted me with measured respect. The board, who used to listen to Clarissa's silky little suggestions, now leaned toward my words like they were iron to a magnet. They had seen the storm. They knew where power lived now. The first board meeting I led was nothing short of surgical. I didn't give speeches about legacy or justice. I outlined plans, restructuring steps, financial recovery strategies, and asset realignment. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming control with precision so sharp that no one could question it. James sat at the far end of the table, quietly observing. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone reminded everyone how this shift had begun. When the meeting ended, no one dared to whisper her name. Clarissa had become a gut. The woman who once wrapped my father in a cocoon of sweet words now lived outside the walls she tried to conquer. I heard through quiet channels that she had left Hartford entirely, tailing off to some distant city to start over, clinging to the illusion of charm she thought was power. But charm has an expiration date when the mask is pulled off. No one in this city would touch her again. My father, on the other hand, stayed. He still lived in the house, though from what little I heard, he rarely left it. I didn't check on him. I didn't need to. His silence was louder than any confrontation. The man who once slammed the door in my face now sat behind that same door, no one left to protect him from the weight of his choices. That was never my revenge. That was his consequence. The company thrived faster than I expected. My mother's foresight had made sure her legal structures were airtight, but it was her vision that truly gave the company life. She had built Hale Construction not to make a man powerful, but to keep a family's legacy standing. And I was the only one left willing to protect it. I spent hours in the office she once occupied, running my fingers over the edges of the old drafting table she'd loved. I could still imagine her bent-over blueprint silver bracelet glinting under the lamp. That image anchored me more than anything else. One evening after a long day of meetings, I stood in that office alone, looking out over Hartford. The city lights blinked against the night, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a trespasser in my own life. I felt like I belonged exactly where I stood. People started coming back to me. Employees who had kept their heads down during the chaos came forward with quiet words of loyalty. "We're glad it's you now," one of them said softly. I didn't need their apologies. I didn't hold it against them. People survive the way they know how. But the shift was real. The company no longer whispered Clarissa's name like a secret. It spoke mine like a fact. One day, I found the bracelet in a small box that James had recovered after the legal transition was completed. It had been hidden in a drawer in the master bedroom. I held it in my palm, feeling the weight of it press against my skin, and for a second I was back on that porch in the rain, blood on my lip, watching Clarissa twirl it like a prize. Only now it was mine again. Not just the bracelet, everything. I fastened it on my wrist, and the metal was cool against my skin. But it wasn't the cold of loss anymore. It was steel. 1 week later, I walked through the company doors wearing a black coat, the bracelet gleaming faintly beneath the cuff. People noticed, they always do, but no one said anything. Power doesn't need to be announced, it just settles. Clarissa's final attempt to fight the will through legal channels fell apart quickly. Her attorney withdrew before it even reached court. She had nothing, no proof, no leverage, not even my father to stand beside her. She vanished like smoke on a winter morning. My father tried to call again once. I let it go to voicemail. His voice was different, quieter, smaller. I was wrong, he said. But wrong doesn't erase bruises. It doesn't erase nights in the rain. It doesn't erase the way betrayal carves itself into your ribs like a permanent scar. Forgiveness is a choice, and I didn't owe it to him. Victory wasn't about getting him back. It was about never needing to. The company held its annual dinner 3 months later, a night once planned by Clarissa with all her glittering vanity. This time it was simple, elegant, honest. I stood at the head of the hall wearing a black dress my mother had once loved. The bracelet caught the light as I raised a glass. To legacy, I said, not the kind built on lies, the kind that stands. The applause was soft but genuine, not for show, for respect. And somewhere deep in my chest, the ache that had lived there for so long finally began to loosen. My father wasn't there that night. His seat was empty. Clarissa's name was a whisper long dead. I didn't need either of them to make the moment whole. Victory wasn't about revenge. It was about reclamation. Taking back what was stolen. Standing on ground that was always yours but that someone else tried to bury you beneath. It wasn't loud. It was quiet, solid, unshakable. A year before, I had stood outside in the rain with nothing but a suitcase and a wound where my family used to be. Now I stood at the head of everything they had tried to tear away, and I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The rain had washed away the wreckage. All that remained was mine. 1 year after the night I was thrown out of my father's house, the world no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like solid ground beneath my feet, like the silence that comes after a long storm, not empty, but clean. I stood on the porch of my lake house in Vermont, the wind rolling off the water in soft waves, the sky painted with early morning light. It was quiet here, the kind of quiet that wrapped around you instead of pressing against you. This house wasn't the Hale estate. It wasn't a trophy. It was mine because I chose it. The old maple trees stretched tall along the edge of the lake, and the air smelled like cedar and wet earth. Inside the fireplace crackled softly, and on the mantel sat a single-framed photograph of my mother. She was younger in that picture, hair swept up, eyes bright. And beneath the frame lay the silver bracelet polished and whole, resting on velvet. I picked it up and slipped it around my wrist, the metal cool and smooth against my skin. The first time I wore it, I was a little girl who believed the world would always protect her. The second time, I was a woman bleeding on the porch watching everything crumble. But now, as the clasp clicked softly shut, I wore it as someone who had rebuilt everything from ashes. The company was thriving. The board followed my lead. The people who had once doubted me now measured their steps around me with respect. The house my father lived in was silent, its walls stripped of the illusions Clarissa had wrapped around them. She was gone a ghost that Hartford barely remembered. Her name didn't echo anymore, not in the company, not in the house, not in me. My father never showed up at the company again. He sent letters a few times, all short awkward like a man trying to hold water in his hands. I read them but didn't answer, not out of cruelty, out of finality. Some doors don't need to be slammed to stay closed. They just remain untouched. I thought for a long time about forgiveness. People talk about it like it's a switch you can flip, like it's the only noble ending to betrayal. But the truth is simpler and quieter. I didn't need to forgive him to be free of him. I just needed to stop letting his choices define the shape of my life. The night I understood that something heavy slid off my chest for good. One late afternoon, I drove back to Hartford for the first time since the storm. The city hadn't changed much. The same old storefronts, the same church steeple piercing the skyline. I parked across the street from the house where it had all begun. The porch light was still there, casting the same tired yellow glow it had the night he threw me out with blood on my lip and a suitcase at my feet. My father sat inside, alone, his figure visible through the living room window, his shoulders slumped forward. I didn't knock. I didn't need to. I just watched for a moment, not with bitterness, but with distance. The storm lived here once. It didn't anymore. When I left, the sound of my boots on the sidewalk felt steady, unshakable. No part of me belonged to this house anymore. The next morning, I stood in the boardroom that once echoed with Clarissa's soft manipulation. I wore a dark gray suit, hair pulled back, the silver bracelet catching the light with every gesture. The board listened closely, not out of fear, but because they knew the weight of my presence. Legacy wasn't something I inherited anymore. It was something I commanded. After the meeting, James joined me in my mother's old office. He leaned against the doorframe with that quiet expression he always wore, the one that meant he saw more than he said. "You know," he said, "she would have been proud of this." I looked down at the drafting table she once used, the same one Clarissa had once tried to replace with some sterile modern desk. "I didn't do it for pride," I said softly. "I did it to make sure she's never erased." He nodded. He understood. People like James always do. That night, instead of driving home right away, I stayed in the office long after everyone left. The building hummed softly, the way old buildings do when they're breathing with their history. I walked through the hallways alone, past the portraits, past the rooms where voices once conspired to push me out, past the corners where Clarissa used to stand in her careful dresses pretending she belonged. And I realized something simple. She had built her power on my father's weakness. I had built mine on my own strength. That's why hers collapsed and mine endured. The following week, I officially launched the Scholarship Foundation in my mother's name. It wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was a permanent reminder of where this legacy came from. The opening ceremony was small, just family, friends, board members, and a handful of scholarship recipients. I stood at the podium overlooking the lake outside the company's main hall. No rehearsed speech. No theatrics, just truth. "This isn't about revenge," I told them. "This is about preservation, about protecting something that mattered before me and will matter long after I'm gone." The applause that followed wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. I felt my mother's presence in the room like sunlight through a window. When the ceremony ended, I walked out into the cool evening air. I had worn the bracelet that night. It had caught the soft light the same way it did when my mother wore it on site visits with a hard hat and steel boots, the same way it did when I watched it fall onto the porch floor a lifetime ago. Only now no one could touch it but me. Clarissa tried to call once after she left Hartford. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice was sharp, not pleading. "You think this is the end?" she said, but even her threats sounded hollow. A woman like her only holds power when someone believes in the illusion. I didn't. No one did anymore. She faded after that. The last I heard, she was working in some smaller city chasing a life she could never replicate. That's the thing about people who steal instead of build. They can't survive without someone else's foundation. My father wrote one last letter. It arrived 2 weeks after the scholarship ceremony. His handwriting was unsteady, uneven. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't try to explain. All he wrote was that he'd watched the ceremony on the news and that he hoped I was happy. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer, not out of affection, but as a final marker. Some stories end with a bang. Some end with a whisper. His ended with silence. On the anniversary of the night I was thrown out, I returned to that porch alone. It was raining again, light and cold. I stood exactly where I had stood a year ago, but everything was different. My shoulders weren't slumped. My hands didn't shake. My eyes didn't search the windows for someone to choose me. I was the only one who had to choose me now. The yellow porch light flickered faintly. My father didn't come to the door. He didn't have to. This moment wasn't about him anymore. It was about me and the woman I became because of that night. I turned away from the house without looking back, walking through the rain as it slicked over the pavement. It wasn't bitter. It wasn't sweet. It was just final. When I got back to the lake house, I lit the fireplace and sat down on the couch with a blanket wrapped loosely around me. The silver bracelet caught the firelight glowing softly against my wrist. A year ago, I was a daughter begging to be heard. Now I was a woman who didn't need permission to exist. My voice didn't tremble anymore. It carried weight because I finally believed in it. The company was mine. The legacy was secure. And the people who once tried to erase me were nothing more than echoes in the distance. Before turning off the lamp, I opened my laptop to draft something I'd been thinking about for weeks. A message not to them, but to others who might be where I once stood. To anyone who's ever been thrown out of their own home, silenced or betrayed by someone they trusted, you are not powerless. They want you to believe you are because that's how they win. But the truth is, power isn't taken from you. It's buried beneath the weight of their lies. And the moment you decide to dig it out, they can't stop you. I paused for a moment, fingers resting on the keyboard, then added the final line. Tell me your story. I'll be listening. Outside, the rain finally stopped. The night was quiet again, steady and soft. I leaned back into the couch, the fire crackling low, the bracelet warm against my skin. It didn't hurt to remember anymore. It didn't sting to breathe. The woman who once stood outside, begging to be let in, no longer existed. I didn't need the house. I didn't need the apology. I didn't need anything from them. All I needed was this moment, this quiet, this strength that belonged entirely to me. And as the wind rolled softly over the lake, I let myself exhale fully for the first time in a very long time. The storm that nearly broke me had built me instead, and the world finally was silent.